Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Ulrich, and I'm the director here at NYU Washington, D.C. I am happy to welcome you all to the Abramson Family Auditorium here at our newest global site for this very important discussion on the impact of new presidential election rules in 2016. As you may know, this is the fourth event in our summer series, Democracy Next, Voices, Votes, and Vision, in partnership with FairVote. We hope to see you back on August 19th for our final event, the Forum on the State of Women's Representation. We also encourage you to visit our public programming website, our Facebook and Twitter for photos, video from our events, and additional content. A quick thank you to a few people, Shruti Ramadugu and Tom McIntyre, who always do a great job of putting these events on. And a special extended welcome tonight to Ronald Abramson, who joins us, and the entire Abramson family who are not here, but we're happy to have Ronald, of course, for their generosity and continued interest in the program. We are so happy to have you here today and truly appreciate your partnership and friendship. The rules of the electoral game have a major impact on the way elections are conducted. As we look to the 2016 presidential election, we question today what rules are set in stone and which ones may change. Will current Electoral College rules be changed in the National Popular Vote Plan? Will Michigan and Pennsylvania change their winner-take-all voting rules to dividing electoral votes instead? How might the major parties change the nomination schedule and rules affecting caucuses, primaries, and their conventions? What will be the impact of changes in voting laws in key swing states? We welcome an esteemed panel of guests to introduce these very important issues. I am happy to introduce Krist Novoselic, chairman of the board of FairVote, who will introduce the panelists today. You may recognize Krist as a member of the groundbreaking rock group Nirvana. After Nirvana, Krist went on to become one of the rock's most politically minded musicians. After completing a book tour with FairVote in 2004 for his book Of Grunge and Government, Let's Fix This Broken Democracy, Krist joined FairVote's board in 2005 and was elected chair in 2008. Please join me in welcoming Krist.
Thank you very much. I just left Indianapolis this afternoon. I fly a Cessna plane, and so I made it here. It was a good flight. I flew all the way from Astoria, Oregon, but I live in Washington State. Darby and I left yesterday to be here to flew. But I am Krist Novoselic, and I am the chairman of FairVote, and it's an honor to be here today and to join with NYU Dialogues for our series Democracy Next, Voices, Votes, and Vision. And NYU has been a great partner, and we appreciate their help with this remarkable auditorium. And speaking of this auditorium, Ron Abramson planned to join us today. He's here today, right? I never missed him. There you are, Ron. Nice to meet you, by the way. Chris. So I just got here. But my special thanks to you for connecting us with this great auditorium. And FairVote, it's a special organization for me, and I'm proud to be part of it. It was back in the 1990s. I was working on music issues in Washington State, and there's censorship, closing down concerts, and so that's how I got my civic education, is how do we engage our government and to make more inclusive rock shows. And then along the way, that's how I got my civic education and how things work. And I also learned how things don't work, right? And we saw some of that in Victoria's film earlier. And so I was looking into reforms, and one of the reforms that I'm really excited about is proportional voting. And back in the 90s, it was FairVote was the only group in the United States working on that issue. And here it's 2013, and FairVote is the only group. FairVote is the only group in the United States working on that issue. So I'm great to be working with FairVote, and it's all part of our core ethos in that representative democracy. In a representative democracy, we must respect every vote and every voice. And you should have seen copies of our 2020 reform vision plan as you checked in, and it lays out our goals. And so if maybe on the way out, if you didn't get one, you can get one on the way out. And so our goals are winning fair representation, voting for Congress and in many states, PR, right? Opening up voter choice with ranked choice voting and primary rules that balance inclusion and freedom of association. We want to establish a national popular vote for president based on one person, one vote and majority rule. And finally, upholding our fundamental right to vote through building local, state, and national support for a constitutional amendment, constitutional right to vote, and create local actions to protect and expand participation. Today's forum focuses on presidential elections. The White House is only one office in the nation of more than 300 million people, but it obviously is a very powerful one. Nothing really captures the imagination like an election for the President of the United States. And we need to get it right, but unfortunately, we don't. Our great lineup of speakers will look at the 2016 presidential election. What rules are set in stone, and which ones may change? Will current Electoral College rules be replaced with a national popular vote plan for president? Will Michigan and Pennsylvania change their winner-take-all voting rules to rules dividing electoral votes? How might the major parties change the nomination schedule and rules affecting caucuses, primaries, and conventions? What will be the impact of changes in voting laws in key swing states? As with other forums in our series, NYU is recording our panel live and we'll have it available at democracynext.com. For that reason, when it comes to questions, we will collect 3x5 cards that will enable me to ask your questions to our panel. So let me turn to introducing our panel. Pat Rosenstiel is a senior consultant for National Popular Vote, which leads advocacy efforts to pass the National Popular Vote Plan for President. He had one-on-one meetings with literally hundreds of state legislators and spoke to national, state, and local audiences about this proposal. He is CEO of Ainsley Shea, which, in its words, solves a lot of problems in business, trade, and politics for clients who run some of the coolest organizations, industry groups, and campaigns on the planet. Did I pronounce that right, Ainsley Shea?
You did great.
Thanks, Pat.
I didn't write.
Okay. Neither did I. Victoria Bassetti is the author of Electoral Dysfunction, a Survival Manual for American Voters, associated with the PBS documentary Electoral Dysfunction that aired nationally in 2012. Her works on voting have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Harper's Magazine. She worked at the Senate Judiciary Committee as Chief Counsel and Staff Director for subcommittees. Victoria? Andrea Levien. Andrea Levien is Research Associate at FairVote, who has focused primarily on presidential elections and Electoral College reform. Andrea graduated from Yale in 2012, writing her senior thesis on the effects of the Electoral College on the voting power of racial minorities. At FairVote, she published a long article in Presidential Studies Quarterly on the breakdown of the current Electoral College rules and regularly publishes new material, including a recent analysis on the focus of her presentation today on the state-based proposals to divide electoral votes. Rob Richie has been executive director of FairVote since 1992. His writings have appeared in the nation's leading newspapers and in 9 books, including as co-author of Every Vote Equal, about establishing a national popular vote for president, and Whose Votes Count, about the case for proportional voting and ranked choice voting. He has been a regular guest on national public radio, C-SPAN, and cable and network talk programs. Hendrik Hertzberg is a senior editor at The New Yorker, where he has written off and on since 1969. In between, he has been the chief White House speechwriter for Jimmy Carter and edited the New Republic magazine, and has been a fellow at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. His political writings are among the most widely praised of any living journalist today. Collected in one volume called Politics, Observations and Arguments. I have a signed copy. Okay, well, we're going to start our panel, and the speakers are going to come up to the podium. And Pat, please come up.
Chris, thank you.
Appreciate the introduction. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, FairVote. Thank you, NYU, for the opportunity to be here today. Grateful. I guess the topic of conversation is what changes are possible for the 2016 presidential election. I'm here to say that I'm hopeful that we will have a change in the way that we do elect the President of the United States, and we'll do so in a way where every voter in every state will matter equally in every presidential election. That's what the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is all about. How does it work? It leverages the power left to the states under Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution that they put up on the screen there. Article 2, Section 1, there are 17 words in it that says each state shall appoint in a manner the legislature thereof shall direct a number of electors. That means it's up to the states to determine how they want to award their electors. It's the most exclusive power left to the states in the United States Constitution, and it's one that the National Popular Vote Compact preserves. Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution allows states to form agreements amongst themselves. They're called interstate compacts, and every state is involved in a number of these. The Great Lakes Compact is an interstate compact. The states agree how they're going to use that collective resource for the betterment of the country in those states. National Popular Vote is an interstate compact that state legislatures are free to join through a simple majority vote of their legislator. Article 2, Section 1 allows them to do that. When states pass the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, right, they agree to award their electors on the basis of the national popular vote. Only, however, when there are 270 electoral votes in the compact, right? So if states totaling 270 or more electoral votes pass our legislation on or before July 20th of a presidential year, it becomes the governing system by which we elect the president. Those states with 270 or more electoral votes, a majority of the Electoral College, agree to award their electors in block to the candidate who gets the most popular votes in all 50 states, or the candidate who wins the national popular vote. Okay? So the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact does three things in essence, right? One, it preserves the state power to award electors, right? Two, it awards a majority of the Electoral College to the candidate who gets the most popular votes in all 50 states, guaranteeing that the president, the candidate who wins the popular vote, is the president, right? And the third thing it does is it makes every voter in every state equally important to the presidential campaigns, which is not the case in the current system. If you look back to the 2012 race for president, right? 4 out of 5 voters were ignored in this country. Okay, they lived in flyover states, right? Once Barack Obama and Mitt Romney were the nominees, they campaigned in just 12 states. Those tickets did. I think Barack Obama visited 8 states in the 2012 election, right? Mitt Romney visited 10. They spent $987 million campaigning for the presidency, and they spent it all in 12 states. Okay? So that means that 4 out of 5 Americans in 4 out of 5 of the states were ignored by candidates as they seek the presidency. We believe that's a real problem, and it's a problem that can be fixed. Where are we at today? Rhode Island just passed our legislation. They became the 11th state to pass our legislation, and we have 136 electoral votes, states totaling 136 electoral votes that have passed our legislation. We're over halfway there. We've passed 31 legislative chambers in 21 states, and we've had bills dropped in all 50 states. National Popular Vote is a growing movement of Republicans, Democrats, Independents, conservatives, liberals, and moderates who believe it's wrong that in America 4 out of 5 voters are ignored as they seek the presidency. We have been supported by over 2,200 legislators as either legislative sponsors or votes for our legislation. This is a movement that's growing across the country, in all regions of the country, and everywhere we go, we're building bipartisan legislative coalitions as the founders would have us do it. You know, just a little, fact. A lot of people, I think, that there's some urban legend out there that National Popular Vote is kind of a liberal idea, right? And I'm standing before you as a Republican, and I'm not exactly a white elephant on this issue. But we're finding that, sort of a number of folks of all political stripes are sort of engaging in this issue, I think primarily for 5 principal reasons, right? Reason number 1 is that every vote mattering is not a liberal or conservative idea, right? It's not a Republican or a Democratic principle. It's a principle of American democracy in a federalist republic. It makes sense that every vote would matter, that each state would have equal influence over the outcome, and each voter would have equal influence over the outcome of electing the President of the United States. And I think by and large, members from all political persuasions are starting to be converted to that principle. 2, I think the constitutional basis for this change, meaning preserving the state power to award electors, the founders they talk a lot about the Constitution in your stuff. The founders debated over 22 days and took 30 different votes trying to prescribe to the state the method with which they would award electors. They could not agree, so they were moot on method and left that power to the body of government closest to the people, right? And so national popular vote is the constitutionally appropriate way to make this kind of change. All of our vote, as is pointed out, all of our rights to vote is given to us through the states. National popular vote preserves that federalist principle. It attracts Republicans, Democrats, and independents for that reason. I also think that national popular vote is intellectually honest, right? We hear a lot of people who, throw some darts at our plan, and we answer every objection with reasonable and rational responses, right? When people talk about, the big bad cities like New York and Los Angeles will control everything under a popular vote, we point out the political demography that 85% of this country lives in rural, suburban, and exurban areas, right? 15% of the people live in the top 50 cities. We point out things like George Pataki was elected governor of New York without winning New York, Syracuse, Buffalo, right? All of those big cities in New York couldn't even deliver the governorship of New York. They're certainly not going to control presidential politics. So we're intellectually honest in that every question that ever gets raised, we shine under the light of scrutiny to determine whether or not there's any relevance to it. Okay? So I think we're intellectually honest. I think the opponents aren't necessarily intellectually honest in their opposition. 4, I think national popular vote builds strong local and state parties and political movements, right? It keeps politics closer to the ground under a national popular vote, where every voter is equal in every presidential election. States like my home state of Minnesota isn't exporting political capital to build strong state parties in battleground states like Ohio and Virginia and Illinois. I'm sorry, Ohio, Virginia, not Illinois. Illinois is exporting political economy. And the last thing is I think neither side should be afraid of their ideas, right? I believe as a Republican that America is a center-right country. I have many friends who are not Republicans who believe that America is a center-left country, right? And I think that campaigns are about building messages, driving policies, and creating ideas with the most resonance with the majority of the American people, and national popular vote will force national candidates to do that. So I think I should probably wrap up, right, about 7 minutes. At the end of the day, what are the prospects of national popular vote being the governing system from which we elect the president in 2016? I am very hopeful that 2012 was the last time we had a system for electing the president that leaves 4 out of 5 American voters on the political sideline when we're electing our commander-in-chief. We have legislative efforts going on around the country. We have dropped bills in all 50 states. We have legislative prospects across the country. I don't know where everybody here is from, but anybody who's from New York, call your senator. We could use some help there. We're a lot closer today than we were before. And I'm a believer that national popular vote will be the governing system for electing the president. It used to be, in my mind, a question of if. It is now simply a question of when, because 70% of the American people would like to see this change done. And there's significant political support on all sides of the political aisle. I make no predictions just because I'm not in the business of predictions, and would look forward to any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Pat. Victoria Bassetti.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thanks to Rob and Krist for inviting me here. I really appreciate it. FairVote's been a really wonderful organization that I've gotten a chance to know and work with over the course of the last few years. Rob asked me specifically to speak rather not specifically on the topic of the national popular vote, but instead to discuss the issue of voter enfranchisement and disenfranchisement prospectively in the 2016 election. And I think that, it can't come as much of a surprise to us to know that votes lead to power, and so not much of a surprise to realize that power, raw and partisan, is so often brought to bear on the mechanics of voting. In recent years, it feels like we've sort of had a tidal wave of efforts to manipulate or change the rules under which people vote. Many people might have thought in the early beginning of the 21st century that the way we voted was more or less comfortably established. But in the last decade, there's been a real explosion of efforts to manipulate and alter and sometimes to suppress the vote in the United States. 2012, with its long lines, with its stories of voter suppression, voter ID, restricted voting hours, was probably just a precursor for what will be an even more explosive and complex systems of changes to the way we vote in 2016 and 2014. And the kind of opening gate was the Supreme Court's ruling earlier this summer in Shelby County, which struck down a significant portion of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which had an enormous impact upon the way voting laws were implemented in a large portion of the United States. One of the things I think you probably saw in the clips beforehand was that, we have 13,000 voting districts. Each of them have their own separate rules, and each of them are run by partisan, in most cases are run by partisan administrators, and the rules are set by state legislatures. In short, we have the fox guarding the chicken coop in the United States. I want to focus in my discussion on 4 key changes that are coming and that are really exploding this year, and which will kind of probably reach a crescendo in 2016. But it means, unfortunately, that I'm going to have to leave a few important things aside, which I'll discuss at the end, important things which can have a really dramatic impact on voter turnout. The first is voter identification requirements. So in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County, 2 states immediately announced that voter ID requirements that had previously been subject to the Department of Justice's pre-clearance requirements were going to go into effect. Texas announced immediately that their voter ID requirements were going to go into effect. So did Mississippi. Virginia is probably about to implement it. Alabama likewise. Texas, North Carolina. More restrictive rules regarding voter identification requirements have been imposed in Tennessee this year. Wisconsin looks like it's probably going to begin implementing voter ID requirements. There's a little bit of a split between 2 courts right now, but we'll see where it ends up. South Carolina will be implementing its voter ID requirements, and Pennsylvania, which was the subject, as many of you know, of an extensive amount of reporting last year regarding voter ID, and it was ultimately held back, is going to be a go in 2014 and 2016. Just recently, the head of the Republican State Party in Pennsylvania bragged that all of the turmoil and tumult around voter identification requirements in Pennsylvania in 2012 probably drove down turnout. I think that, combined with the Mike Turzine clip that you saw beforehand, really illustrates the singular motivation behind some of these voter identification requirements. So, grand total, post-Shelby, and in this year alone, voter identification requirements, either stricter or new, implicate 136 Electoral College votes, approximately 90 million people in the United States. That's not 90 million voters, but residents, 90 million residents of those states. That's new in 2013. I think by the time 2014 is done, by the time we get to 2016, I wouldn't be terribly surprised if it's a substantially larger number. Indeed, in 2013, new proposals regarding voter identification got pretty far along in Illinois, Iowa, Maryland, it failed. Massachusetts, Nebraska, Nevada, New Jersey, New Mexico also failed. New York, West Virginia, Wyoming. It's a tidal wave and it's going to keep happening. Meanwhile, early voting has been a little bit more of a mixed bag. So anyone who kind of remembers those long lines in Florida in 2012 will recall that a large reason why there were such long lines in Florida was because Florida had so severely restricted its early voting. There were other reasons why there were long lines in Florida, but one of them was the early voting restrictions. Fortunately, in response to what had happened in Florida, Florida actually seems to have kind of taken a step in the right direction and expanded its early voting hours and improved them. Maryland did the same thing. Illinois expanded locations. Colorado also expanded locations. So there's been a little bit of positive movement on early voting, but more recently, North Carolina has stripped a whole week away from voting and from early voting. And if you want to kind of have a quick idea of the partisan aim behind restricting early voting, keep in mind that in North Carolina in 2012, there were something on the order of 2.7 million votes that were cast early voting. Of them, 47% were cast by Democrats, 32% were cast by Republicans. So by suppressing and restricting early voting in North Carolina, you basically have a significant partisan impact. North Carolina is obviously one of these states that things are really exploding right now, if anyone's been reading in the news, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. The other thing I wanted to talk about, the third major thing, and I'm going to try to wrap it up pretty quickly, is citizenship issues. Earlier in the year, the Supreme Court in Arizona versus Intertribal Council struck down an effort by Arizona to require people registering in the state of Arizona to provide proof of citizenship. And the Supreme Court struck it down essentially on the basis of the fact that there was an overriding federal law regarding registration forms, and basically Arizona was adding something that it couldn't add to a federal form. And you would think, you might hope that this Supreme Court decision would put an end to basically attempting to suppress the Latino vote by using kind of citizenship check requirements, but it's not clear that the Supreme Court's decision is going to have that large an effect. To begin with, Arizona apparently is planning to begin suing the Election Administration Commission, which is essentially a moribund organization at this stage of the game. So Arizona is going to continue to seek to put a citizen proof requirement on its registration forms. Florida, in the wake of Shelby County, is proceeding with a voter roll purge, where initially, prior in 2012, they were barred from engaging in this purge of non-citizens allegedly on their voter rolls. They targeted 180,000 people in 2012 to be struck off their lists. A stay was imposed as a result of the Voting Rights Act. That stay was lifted on Wednesday. So Florida is proceeding with its effort. Kansas is rejecting voter registrations on the basis of whether or not someone may or may not be a citizen based on kind of quirky DMV records. So Kansas has rejected 12,000 voter registration forms this year on the basis that the person may or may not be a citizen. They're not entirely sure. Meanwhile, North Carolina has indicated that it's going to increase its purging of its voter rolls. So I think that, voter ID may be the issue of 2010, 2011. Voted in their college, where they're resident in college. So in other words, if your child goes away to college and then registers to vote elsewhere, you would lose that $2,500 dependency credit. Ohio, in the meantime, attempted to impose and may yet impose an extraordinary penalty on its colleges. Ohio basically was going to impose a requirement on its colleges that if many colleges, in order to encourage student registration in Ohio, would give the student a zero balance utility bill, right? So that the kid could then use that to register to vote in their in the city in Ohio where they go to college. It was a proof of residency for the students in Ohio. So the Ohio State Legislature passed a requirement which would basically say that if a college issued one of those zero balance utility bills, then it would be required to charge that student in-state tuition, which would mean all of a sudden a huge budget shortfall for every college. So every college in Ohio was basically faced with the prospect of either losing, and by the way, the number was something like $370 million to Ohio colleges. They would lose $370 million in revenue if they attempted to enable their students to vote in Ohio. Moreover, North Carolina eliminated pre-registration for 16 to 17-year-olds. So as you can see, a tidal wave of continuing efforts to alter and manipulate the availability of the franchise to people in the United States. Three of the things I didn't get to talk about, I could talk forever, obviously, is one of the impacts of Shelby is that polling site locations will now no longer be reviewed by the Department of Justice. And that's a classic way of being able to kind of alter turnout to basically shift a polling site location from a center to something far away from minority locations where public transportation is difficult. Vote dilution plans will also be deeply affected by Shelby County. And then finally, the one thing that is, I think, really frightening is that many of the machines that we're using today to vote on were first bought and implemented in the wake of the 2000 election and as a result of money that the federal government put in for the Help America Vote Act. Most of those machines are 10 years old now. They're rapidly decaying. They're computers. They're not necessarily being updated that well. We spent well over $2 billion in implementing those machines. These machines are now rapidly decaying. It's unclear where the money is going to come from to buy new machines or to upgrade the machines that we've currently got in place. So we've probably got a little bit of a mess coming our way in 2014 and 2016 if we don't look out. I often say, in conclusion, that if American voters were treated, are basically consumers, and that if the American industry, like McDonald's or Starbucks, treated its customers the way our voting system treats its voters, the American economy would be in a state of complete collapse. And it's really a testament to the determination of Americans that they keep getting out and voting despite being treated somewhat shabbily by the system that's supposed to serve them. Thanks.
Thank you, Victoria. Andrea Levien is going to speak about state-based proposals to divide electoral votes.
So you heard from Pat about a great proposal called National Popular Vote that would make every vote in every state equal. But National Popular Vote actually wasn't the only Electoral College reform that was proposed this year. There were two different proposals in two different states, Virginia and Pennsylvania, to change the way that the states allocated their electoral votes. And both served very partisan purposes. So when you're designing an electoral college reform, you want to make sure that it meets several criteria. You want to make sure that the candidate who gets the most votes nationwide wins, basic fairness. You want to make sure that the plan doesn't advantage one party over another. You want to make sure that the candidates want to compete for votes in every corner of the nation, that some votes aren't more valuable than others. And you also want to make sure that the election isn't tied so that it doesn't go to the House. So the two proposals that were put forth this year, one was for a congressional allocation of electoral votes, and the other one was for a proportional allocation of electoral votes. Congressional allocation of electoral votes, as you can imagine, is a very distorted affair. We know from the 2012 congressional elections that Democrats actually won 1.5 million more votes nationwide in the House, but they didn't win a majority in the House. It would be equally distorted in a presidential election in which Barack Obama got 5 million more votes, but Mitt Romney would have won the presidency by about 20 electoral votes if we had congressional allocation. But that didn't stop one senator in Virginia from proposing a plan that would allocate electoral votes by congressional district and then also give 2 extra votes, the 2 votes in the Electoral College that represent the 2 senators for a state, to the winner of the most congressional districts in that state, not even the most popular votes in that state, which is the general way that people propose congressional allocation plans. So in this measure that he put forth, it was clearly an attempt to take some votes from Democrats. Barack Obama won all 13 of Virginia's electoral votes in 2012, and to give 9 of them to Mitt Romney and 4 to Barack Obama. And if his plan had been adopted in 6 states, the 6 states that went to Barack Obama in 2012, but which have Republican-controlled governments right now, Mitt Romney would have won. If you change the way that votes are allocated in just 6 states, you can change the outcome of the election, and even an election in which a candidate that gets 5 million more votes, the outcome can be changed. But luckily that bill died a pretty quick death. But there's another proposal in Pennsylvania that's still active. It was proposed by Senate Majority Leader Dominic Pileggi, and it's a plan to split electoral votes proportionally. So you might think that splitting votes proportionally would be a more fair way of allocating electoral votes. After all, if you win 51% of the votes in a state, why should you get all 100% of their electoral votes? And Republicans in Pennsylvania normally get for the last 6 elections, have gotten about 46% of Pennsylvania's popular votes. But when you look at the way that the Pileggi plan would actually play out, you realize that it doesn't actually do much to increase fairness in the way that we elect the president. We at FairVote did an analysis on how this plan would have played out nationwide, and we found that swing states, the current swing states that we see in our winner-take-all system, are still very advantaged under the plan, except that instead of having 140 swing electoral votes, you would now have only 58. The candidates would be buying over 58 electoral votes in a close election, and the other votes would be set in stone for whichever candidate. So we found that 9 states would have 4 swing electoral votes. Those are mostly the current swing states that you see. And this is partially because of the oddity of the Pileggi plan, in which you don't round electoral votes to the nearest integer, but the person who won the popular vote in that state would actually get an extra boost and get to round their vote total up an integer, and the loser would get it knocked down an integer. So you find that when you're near the 50% threshold for a state, which is a swing state, you get an extra boost. 3 more states would have 3 electoral votes in play, 2 more would have 2, and then 9 states would have 1 electoral vote in play. 9 electoral votes would have 1 electoral vote in play. And these new votes, these new states are actually not swing states right now. So that is something that is interesting about the plan. But you see that it distorts the vote so much. And the oddest part of this plan is that no matter what size the swing state is, it has the same number of votes in play. So right now New Hampshire has 4 electoral votes in play, and Florida has 29. So it makes sense to campaign a little bit more in Florida, so you get those 29 electoral votes as opposed to New Hampshire. But in this plan, Florida would only have 4 electoral votes in play, and New Hampshire would have 4. So the voters in New Hampshire would have about 10 times the voting power of a voter in Florida, which means that the distorted campaigning that we see now would be multiplied. So I think what this shows is just how vulnerable our current winner-take-all system is to different attempts to change how the system can benefit one party or another. Both of these proposals are unlikely to pass, but it really just shows how vulnerable our system is and why the national popular vote needs to be passed very, very soon. Thanks.
FairVote Executive Director, Robert Richie.
Good afternoon. Well, thank you for these great presentations, and thanks for all of you being here. I care deeply about general elections for president, and legislative elections and local elections and the rest of it too. But there is another part of the presidential election process that is fascinating in that when we're in the midst of it, it's like everyone's like talking about every little particular part of it, and CNN is incredible graphics and so on, and then it's over, and then we sort of forget about it for 4 years. And I'm talking about the presidential nomination process and the rules and the primaries. And the reason why it's particularly interesting to talk about, both for 2016, I think, and for what we as believers in a fair process can do about it, is that on the one hand, it's very changeable. The rules are in play, and they often change election cycle to cycle. And part of that is because a national party can change its rules, a state party can change its rules, a state government can change the rules, and one party can change the rules, and maybe the other party doesn't change the rules. So, there's a lot of different players that can actually make a change that has an incredible impact on who might be the next president, because typically a major party candidate is going to be our next president, and these fine points of rules can have a big impact on who gets that momentum boost and who does well. It also means it's very complex to do an organically consistent plan because of all those different players. And that's part of it that we should remember, is that when we're talking about the nomination process, we're not talking about really a government function. These are party associations. These are people who come together, they organize, they've come together as parties. We think of the parties as sort of entrenched parts of the American constitutional system. They're not, right? They are associations of people, and they have become, of course, very, very powerful and influential, and their selection of who runs as their nominee has an incredible impact on who wins and loses. But they have a lot of rights and abilities to change things, and they are. And that's part of the story looking to 2016, is some of what we have seen in the past probably will not happen. Some of it's still in play. Some of it could change right up close till the next election. For instance, we talked about the North Carolina bill that just passed the state Senate a couple hours ago. And I'll just parenthetically say that one of our signature issues is voter pre-registration for 16-year-olds. The idea that people can get registered to vote when they are in high school and at the DMV for the first time, and they can then have that registration become activated when they hit voting age. And it's passed in Florida with a Republican legislature. It's passed in Maryland with a Democratic legislature. It's passed in North Carolina with bipartisan support. And they're just getting rid of it at the same time as they're saying that if you register in college, not at home, you will lose your parents may lose the ability to claim you as an independent or to claim you as a dependent. So basically, it's making people harder to register. North Carolina is doing some problematic things, but one of the things that's interesting is it also has in the bill saying that it will hold its primary right after the South Carolina primary. And as you may know, South Carolina is one of the favored 4 states, right? So the 4 states that at this point have been sort of blessed and tapped as the states that get that special status at the start are Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada. And it is because those states, the people of those states are generally better educated, better people than the rest of us, and I think we all pretty much agree on that. So we let them have this role year after year because they really do it better than we could. Is anyone from one of those states here? You often can see like a little glow as they sit there. But North Carolina, as other states have done this too, have said no. We want to be part of it, right? So that. If this bill goes through and becomes law, they will actually be right after the South Carolina primary, subject potentially to penalties and the whole issues that can happen when a state tries to move up in violation of the national party rules. So the state party, isn't making this decision. It's the state legislature. Now, of course, the state legislature can be connected to decision makers in the state party, but it's the state government that's making a decision that could cost the state party a lot of delegates at the convention, and it shows the sort of complexity of it. But so things are in play. The schedule may change. Now, you may know that in 2004 and 2008 and 2012, we voted quite early. The holidays, we celebrate the end of the year, and boom, suddenly it's the Iowa caucuses. So the candidates are having to do a lot of campaigning in 2011 to have any chance to win, in the year before to have a chance to win those key opening contests. In fact, here we are in July 2013, right? And so we're basically 2 years away from where the campaign will be an intense focus, and debates will be starting and all of this because of this early way that we are holding our contests. And the reason we have early contests is every state wants to get ahead of every other state, and New Hampshire says it must be ahead of every other state by state law, and because they're special people, they actually get that special right to do that. And the parties allow them to do that, but they don't have to. And that's part of what is going to be interesting. It's not going to change for 2016. I think it's a very clear fact that we are going to have those same states go first, but we may have a mix of other states going early, and there will be a fight over rules, and it gets very much based on which candidates are in the mix and who might be helped by it or not, and so it still remains a messy process. The Republicans have had a historical tradition of saying they could only change key parts of the nomination process at the convention. For the first time in 2008, they actually changed that to allow an interim change, which actually led to some, what I would say, positive changes for 2012. They tried to push things back a little bit, or later into the year for the first contest, so that there would be a little more of a breathing room from the 2011. And they said that states that went before April 1st would need to allocate their convention delegates proportionally rather than on a winner-take-all basis. And so we just heard about how allocating electoral votes on a proportional basis can be problematic. When you're picking convention delegates who are coming together at a convention and playing kind of a constructive, meaningful role, and also trying to include as many states as possible, a winner-take-all rule combined with a schedule in which some states goes first tends to make the front runner just the runaway winner, right? So once you start getting ahead and you get that momentum, like John Kerry in 2004, he had some big early wins, then he just kind of took off, right? And they didn't have winner-take-all contests there, but on the Democratic side, but they had this sort of momentum-building process. When you add into that winner-take-all, so you're not only getting momentum, but getting all the delegates, then it's really hard for any candidate to ever catch up. So the Republicans have had a debate about whether to use winner-take-all or proportional. They used proportional for these early contests, and they were supposed to. Florida kind of violated that rule. It was another kind of rule change fight. But that's one of the decisions they are actually going to be making about whether to keep that requirement or not. Right now it's actually not in place, but there's an expectation that will be put back in place. And that'll actually be this sort of wonky decision, but it'll make it'll contribute to whether the contests end up being contested deeply into the calendar. When they're not contested deeply into the calendar, right, it's over quite soon. And sometimes the parties and the kind of big money people, the party leaders inside the Beltway want that. Typically the state parties and party activists don't want that. They want to have a contest that allows them to kind of bring people in, organize, and there's this tension between having a lot of contests that actually helps a party build itself and sort of getting a quick nominee that people can rally around with the big money and start zeroing in on the general election. So that tension is going to be needed to be resolved. The Democrats won't start their process of looking at rules until next year, they haven't had a meaningful contest in a while because they didn't have one in 2012. But that'll be one to keep an eye on. But what I would suspect is we don't see a lot of changes for 2016. Some things on the edges, like say a state like North Carolina going early. But what I wanted to leave people with is the idea that this is an area that we can change and guided by the principles that guide FairVote, which is we would like to respect every vote and every voice. There are straightforward ways to essentially allow more of us to have a regular way to vote. There's in a major party nomination contest, if that matters to you. And the one proposal that's gotten support is this idea of a rotating regional primary, right? So you'd have, and this is something the National Association of Secretaries of State support. So each quadrant of the country would have a chance to vote sort of in their turn, and then one year they'd be first, and then the next year they'd be last, and then the year after that they'd be second to last, and then every four cycles they'd be first. One of the problems is that they're only first once, and what Nebraska Senator 100 years ago, George Norris, who is sort of a reform hero to people like me because he supported a lot of things that I think were interesting and won some of them, like a unicameral legislature in Nebraska. He proposed that the states would have contests. It could be caucuses, and this question of caucuses versus primaries, that's another key rule decision that we're seeing some debate about. But they have contests that don't end it but winnow the field, and actually end with a national primary. So you would have key contests that matter, but actually end with a national primary that would actually bring some of what a national popular vote for president would also bring. Maybe do that the first Tuesday in June. Both parties do it if they were to sort of come together and do a common plan, and then start the general election season. There's different things that could be done. One other change that I am hoping that we may see some states explore is tied to the fact that in 2016 we have a wide open field right now on the Republican side. We don't on the Democratic side if Hillary Clinton runs. At this point, she's far ahead. But let's say she doesn't run. Then both parties would likely have this sort of wide open process. And we talked about sort of the fact that when you win, you get real momentum. And you can win Iowa, you can win New Hampshire with really low percentages of the vote. Right? Pat Buchanan won New Hampshire with 26% of the vote in 1996. Iowa was won with less than 25% of the vote in 2012. And so one of the proposals we've been putting out there is the idea of ranked choice voting, or an instant runoff system where you rank candidates. And so that you could still allocate delegates proportionally, but also use a different voting method to see who really was the majority winner, who really is the strongest candidate in that state. And caucuses can actually do that relatively straightforwardly, because they're voting on their own system, and they can come up with a way to have a rule that would have a better way to determine who really is the strongest candidate. So it's a last word I guess I'd say on this is it's an important area. The rules are very much in play. There's a lot that can be done, and we shouldn't wait till we're right in the midst of it to think about the things that could make it better. Thanks.
Our last speaker is Hendrik Hertzberg on his thoughts on national popular vote. Rick.
Well, I can keep it relatively brief because Pat Rosenstiel did such a beautiful job of explaining this. If you want to hear him really go to town, there's a video of him debating a Duke University anti-NPV professor, and it's almost cruel what you do to him. I just want to say a couple of things about NPV. I've been involved with FairVote for I guess 20 years or more, and with this NPV proposal ever since the first press conference where it was announced, an ill-attended little gathering at the National Press Club in 2006. And that's been my only sort of civic activity apart from opining about politics in the New Yorker has been participating in this kind of thing with FairVote. We hear a lot of pontificating about the Federalist Papers and about what the framers intended when they did this and that they set up the Electoral College because they were worried about mob rule. That's really not quite the case. Actually, they were concerned about ill-informed voters. They had no problem with voters, male to be sure, white to be sure, but they had no problem with voters electing their representatives in the House of Representatives. They were perfectly okay with that. They had no problem with this democratic approval of the Constitution itself. The Constitution itself was approved through through essentially what then passed for universal suffrage process. It's, as Pat said, the framers couldn't agree on a way to select the president. Some wanted Congress to elect the president, and some, including James Madison, wanted it to be a vote of the people. So when you read and he writes, in addition to the Federalist Papers, which were op-ed pieces written to defend a particular compromise at the time, and should be read with some skepticism and caution. In his diary of the Constitutional Convention, Madison writes that he himself was for having it be in the vote of the people. He thought that would be the best way to choose the president. But that there was that there was a little problem of the Negroes. He said that if you were going to elect the president by votes, then the 3/5 would not count. If you elect by population, then that 3/5 counts. I think people often think that the 3/5 rule was a matter of the Southerners saying, oh, a black person is only 3/5 of a person. And that maybe the people who disagreed with that were saying, no, a black person is a person, is 5/5 of a person. Actually, it was the Northerners who wanted slaves to not be counted at all. Why is this such a good idea? There are really four things about this that have made me a firm believer and a passionate supporter of national popular vote. And the wrong winner problem is only one of them. Yes, that's a problem. And it happens about, 1 in every 15 elections. It happens, I think, something like 1 in every 7 non-landslide elections. And in recent decades, it's gotten to be more and more likely that it's going to happen more often. It might have happened in 2004 with a switch of 60,000 votes in one state. Then John Kerry would have been elected president while losing the popular vote by well over 1 million. It could have even happened theoretically in this last election, a change strategically in certain states of a few score thousands of votes would have changed the outcome. But that doesn't happen in every election. What happens in every election is, as Pat said, that 4/5 of the country is essentially disfranchised. So if we had national popular vote, and this is not an exotic idea, there's nothing exotic or un-American about the idea of counting up the votes, seeing who comes in first, and giving that person the office. That's how we elect everybody else. Everybody else. You take the votes in the constituency that the person being elected is supposed to serve, you count them up, and the one with the most votes wins. The only office we don't do that for is the presidency. We have never had a national election. It would be great to have we have a nation, we ought to have a national election instead of 51 separate elections, and then a cockamamie Rube Goldberg way of deciding who comes out the winner of that ludicrous process. If we had national popular vote, then there would be a lot less hand-wringing about low voter participation. If you look at the battleground states where people know their vote counts, you get voting levels that are roughly on a par with Britain. Maybe not quite on a par with Europe, because Britain also has first past the post. But we'd have a much larger voter turnout. And here's another really good reason to be for national popular vote. If you're worried about money in politics, this is the single reform and the only really achievable reform that could do something about that problem. You sometimes hear NPV opponents say, oh my gosh, you look how much, if this election cost $1 billion, just think how much it's going to cost to have one in the whole country. Well, actually, one thing that has never happened is that a presidential campaign has decided, oh, we've raised enough money, we don't have to raise any more. there's a limit to how much money can be raised. But if you, as it is now, that money is raised all over the country, and then it's funneled into a handful of states, into 9 or 10 states, where its impact is hugely magnified. If you had to take that money, even if it was twice as much, and spend it the way every other kind of national marketing campaign spends it, if you had to spread it out through the whole country, then the relative impact of that money would be greatly reduced. And it would be reduced even more because, on the other hand, the impact of voluntarism would be hugely magnified. I think this is the thing that makes me most passionate about the national popular vote. Under the current system, in my state of New York, in Pat's state, in 40 states, it's just pointless to go around your neighborhood leafleting or having a coffee clutch or having a little rally. What's the point? If you want to participate, there's really only two ways. You can give money, or you can travel either electronically or in person to a battleground state. If we had national popular vote, you would see, and I don't think people recognize this quite enough, you would see a tremendous energizing of politics and civic participation throughout the country. You know, when the Constitution was written, local elections were what people were most focused on. That's who they knew. Most people never traveled more than 50 miles from home. So that's one reason that the framers were unskeptical about having them choose their local representatives. These would be people they knew, and they thought that after we'd gotten through George Washington being president and a couple of others, they really wouldn't know who the national figures, they wouldn't necessarily know. Now, we know a lot more about our presidential candidates than we know about our candidates for city council. If there's one office that we're all really qualified to vote for on the basis of being informed, it's president. And if you had every American, every voter in the whole country knowing that their vote meant something, that it counted, that it was needed, then you would see a huge surge of civic energy in this country, and you'd have a more legitimate government in Washington. You wouldn't have as much. There's still a lot wrong with the rest of the system, but you would not have as much of the phenomenon whereby people think that our political arrangements, the Constitution and everything, both written and unwritten, are perfect and handed down from God, and yet things aren't going so well, so therefore it must be because we have bad people in office. It must be all about bad people. And that those moralistic explanations just don't explain very much. And I've gotten involved with this, with FairVote, with national popular vote, partly for that reason, that we don't have worse people than other countries. We don't have worse politicians than other countries. We just have worse incentives for them. We've got a democracy is supposed to work by people getting reelected. So that to get reelected, they do what the people want. But if the hydraulics of the mechanisms do not communicate, don't communicate what the people can't translate what the people want into what the people get, then you get the kind of alienated public that we have now. So tell your representatives that, especially if you're from a non-swing state, this is one place where non-swing state people are more important than swing state people. Please, let's elect our president the way we elect everybody else.
Thanks, Rick. So Q&A, do we have any question cards from folks? And have a FairVote staffer can pick them up? What's that?
They weren't given out.
Oh, we didn't get the cards.
Well, they actually...
We can do the microphones then. I can do a Phil Donahue.
Cards.
Do you have a question? Yes, here's a question right here.
I'm old enough to remember.
Oh, please, the microphone.
I'm old enough to remember when we were terrified of a national Democratic primary because of George Wallace. Every 4 years we thought that's what would happen if we had a national Democratic primary. We didn't even worry about who would win a Republican primary.
Does anyone want to take that on?
Well, I will comment on it quickly. So I will say that the idea of what I would say is not to start with a national primary. Different people have different opinions about what would be best. I like the fact they have to go through some hoops to get through the process, that we learn how they handle adversity and successes, and they have to campaign intensively in a grassroots way in certain states. I don't like the fact that it's always the same states. I don't think that's fair or reasonable. But that having that ability to do that and to make your case in a direct way is a good threshold step to be to going on your way to be president. So what I would like to see, this George Norris proposal, is that they'd go through a sequence of contests that would winnow the field, and they'd have to make their case. They'd winnow the field, but then that final vote would be one that everyone could participate in on an equal basis. I would like to see, given my instant runoff way, that it would be 3 people and there'd be an instant runoff with the 3 top candidates that survived that state-by-state process.
You know that song, Sweet Home Alabama? That's about George Wallace. Yeah. And it's about like the South. He said, we have George Wallace, but the North, you have Nixon. That's what that song's about. Are there any questions? Any more questions? Yes, sir. Can you get him the microphone?
So, supposing we can arrange the 50 states and District of Columbia on a spectrum, with respect to national popular vote, suppose we can arrange them on a spectrum of easily gettable, sort of low-hanging fruit, all the way to the lost causes. Now, to reach to the 270 electoral vote trigger mark for NPV, which states of the ones that are not lost causes are the most difficult to enlist? Why? What makes them difficult to enlist, and how should advocates of NPV proceed in those states in which getting the state legislature to pass a national popular vote will be difficult but not wholly impossible?
It'll actually pick it up.
We'll pick it up. Got it. Well, first of all, let me start with I'm not sure that I believe there are any lost causes. At the end of the day, if there are lost causes, I could see the state of Ohio, the state of Florida, and the state of Virginia, where 2/3 of the money and 2/3 of the influence resides when it comes to electing the president. So the only lost causes on the map, in my mind, in my experience, having traveled through roughly 35 states on this thing, are the ones who have the disproportionate influence under the current system, right? And those are the battleground states. As for what states or what is the profile of the state most likely to pass the national popular vote bill that hasn't done so already, there's a number of states with a number of different profiles where we're at different phases of development. For example, the state of Utah, which is a very Republican, bright red state that has not been a battleground state for 100 years. They're tired of lacking political influence, and U.S. senators like Jake Garn, who are some of the most conservative members of the United States Senate, and a state senator there, Howard Stevenson, who runs the Taxpayers Association, he's leading a legislative effort in Utah, which makes it very fertile ground for national popular vote because they want influence. The state of New York, where we've now passed both legislative chambers. We've passed the state Senate twice. That the first time it was completely Republican controlled. The second time it's kind of a shared power relationship in the New York Senate right now. But we just passed the Assembly on a 100-40 vote in a very bipartisan way. That's 29 electoral votes that I think are ripe to join the compact. The state of New York exported $94 million in political capital during the 2008 election, right? And they got $60,000 spent on television in the last 6 weeks trying to win their votes. So there's a very real self-interest. And, I talk a lot about money and resources and campaign events and stuff like that. What What flyover states are really exporting is political influence, right? Presidents get transactional with battleground voters as it relates to issues. The last election was all about whether or not you thought it was an auto bailout versus a managed bankruptcy, because that's what voters in Ohio wanted to talk about. I remember in the 2004 re-election campaign, it was all about the prescription drug benefit in Part D, because voters in the I-4 corridor of Florida wanted to have free drugs. So I don't know. I think what's more fertile is flyover states than battleground states. And the good news is there are more flyover states. As to how many states we need to enact and get to 270, I think it's looking like somewhere between 20 to 25 states. We have 11 that have already enacted. We've passed 31 legislative chambers in 21 other states. And, I think the reason states have this power is to be rational with it and to maximize the political, economic, and cultural influence of the voters of their states. And when 4 out of 5 of us are being ignored, it's only a matter of time. And what I can say is that legislators are very thoughtful people. And when exposed to the information and exposed to the power that they were ordained with, basically, they're the ones who can decide how we change this system. By and large, they move. By and large, they're thoughtful people. So, if we continue the discourse, it's 3 yard in the cloud of dust activity. We got to meet with every legislator in this country. We need to tell them why national popular vote is in the better interest of their constituents than this current system of winner-take-all rules, which, relegates 4 out of 5 of us to the political sidelines when we're elected, I think, the most important elective office in the world.
I'll just add briefly to that on what can you do, because a lot of it is what Pat is saying. It's direct contact with the legislators, but I think we're at a point with this effort. It's the hardest point in some ways because it's still far enough away that legislators can say, "Well, I can wait," but they want to learn about it if they really want to pass it. So they say, "Well, I can wait and really learn about it later." But each win gets us to a point where they say, "Okay, I really need to learn about this now." And when they learn about it, the facts are on our side. I think what you can do is help make sure that legislators know there's people out there who care, and that it's worth learning about, and that because the facts are on our side. And so what we've seen is that surprising states can take action, as Pat was saying. So and part of it is that a key legislator can really start pushing it if they become a champion.
And I'd add that I guess that one of the reasons to have hope for this is that it is in the narrow, selfish self-interest of politicians in these flyover states. They're nobody during a presidential campaign. They don't get their calls returned. Nobody cares what their advice is, what their strategic notions are. Forget about it. They would be somebody if they could bring their influence and on their constituents to bear on a presidential election. Their jobs would be more fun.
Well, Rob raises an interesting point about urgency. When I'm in legislative offices, oftentimes we'll hear, I got bigger issues to deal with, right? I got state budget issues and all this other stuff. And when you sit down with them and you have a thoughtful conversation, if you're talking to your state legislator, the biggest driver to state budgets in this country is K-12 education, right? No Child Left Behind is the largest unfunded mandate on education in the history of this country. No Child Left Behind was about the education president, George Bush, wanting to get transactional with minivan driving moms in and around Dayton, Ohio. That's what drove that policy decision. And it's very real and has a very meaningful impact on those state budgets. So the systemic problem that is the current system with which we elect the president really does drive state spending and state budgets and state allocation of resources in a way that's meaningful to every legislator in this country. And thoughtful legislators, when you have that kind of dialogue with them, are like, "Oh my God, you're right," and they're moved to urgently deal with it. And most of the NPV bills around the country right now that we have the most chance to bear some fruit on are with self-starting legislators that are tired of this current system that is driving America deeper into debt and telling their constituents that they're not relevant.
I live in Washington State, and our legislature passed the national popular vote a few years ago. Right. And I have a story about Oregon where, and it touches about competition and on nominations. And so because I live close to Oregon, so I go to Portlandia, right? Okay, and I was listening to a rock radio, as I usually do, and there was an ad. This was May of 2008, and there was an ad on rock radio for Barack Obama for president, because he was running in the primary, okay? Because so it was May, and the rules for primary elections were proportional for the nominee for Democrats, and so it was still competitive. It was Clinton versus Obama. So in May of 2008, there were ads on rock radio. And so that's how the idea about they wanted to reel people in. Every voter count. That's the name of the book, right? Mm-hmm. Every vote counts. Is if you want the details of the National Popular Vote Plan, that's the book. It's a free book, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You get it for free. You can't beat the price, okay? Okay, and so that's my point about how competition brings people in. And then you, sir, you had a question. I see you had your hand up. And so get the microphone.
A question about NPV. Do you have any doubts or thoughts about philosophical doubts about the case where a state legislature votes to cast all the electoral votes for the candidate who wins the nationwide popular plurality or majority, be it as it may, but goes against the expressed wishes of the voters in that state? Let's take, for instance, an election in which a Republican candidate wins by about 1 million votes nationwide, but the Democratic candidate wins in California by several million votes, and the California legislature says, well, sorry, folks, we've got to cast our 55 electoral votes for the Republican candidate. Does that have any philosophical or possibly legal ramifications?
I could start with that. I think the answer to the question is no and no. I don't have any philosophical problems with it. The state of California has 55 electoral votes to use in a way that's in the best interest of California. And by joining the National Popular Vote Compact, every vote in California, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian Party, Green Party, every one of them would be cast and go towards a candidate, and they'd be able to see those votes go up on that tote board on election night and know that their vote was going for their candidate and their guy or gal either won or lost. And I don't think there's going to be riots in the streets. When the Republican candidate for president, John McCain, won my home county of Washington County, but lost the state of Minnesota, I wasn't throwing a party because he won Washington County, right? I knew the 10 electoral votes were going to go to Barack Obama. So the truth is the entire system would be defined beforehand. I think when we poll voters in California, they prefer that California's electoral votes go to the winner of the national popular vote. As for legal issues, there are no legal issues. Article 2, Section 1, this is a plenary exclusive power of the state to award electors in any manner they deem is in the best interest of their state. The free will of the California legislature was to join our interstate compact. They are one of the 11 states that have done so. And, case law is settled on this. And frankly, Article 2, Section 1, we don't have to worry about what Federalist Papers say the founders thought about it. We know what they wrote, which is each state shall appoint in a manner the legislature thereof shall direct a number of electors. And that is finished law. There is no wiggle room. There are no legal issues related to national popular vote. As to, electors, casting, it's not like Democratic electors from California would go cast the ballots for California in the Electoral College under your scenario. It would be Republican electors, right? Because each state has 2 slates of electors. And for better or worse, they're not discerning citizens anymore. They're partisan hacks who are there for a reason, which is there to be relied on. So we don't anticipate or expect any problems. Philosophically, certainly not legally.
It's an emotional thing, and a surprising number of legislators. You actually hear this from legislators, and you want to say, you mean you care more about who gets your electoral votes, your state's electoral votes, than who's president?
Right.
I don't mind. I mean, you mentioned that Governor Pataki won. He did not carry New York County, Manhattan, where I vote, and I didn't really celebrate the fact that,
right,
that he lost and yet my governor became somebody that my county didn't vote for.
The only thing the other thing that I'd add there is South Carolina, where I've been fairly active in the movement. I mean, no state that understands political identity really more than South Carolina. I mean, it's sort of inbred in them, right? But to them, it's more important that they have influence, and what they know is during the primary they have a ton of influence, right? Just like your Oregon example. But right after that first in the South primary is over, the loudest sound you hear politically in South Carolina is the buses firing up to drive down to Florida and never to return, right? Because they're reliably red. We know they're going to be with the Republican candidate. So in South Carolina, where identity is a big thing, increasingly influence is most important because they're losing money to dredge their ports to battleground states like North Carolina and Virginia, right? So the reason we have electors as a state is to maximize our political influence, provide an effective check on what Madison called the federal magistrate. That's why states have electors. And so usually rational actors will do that in a way where they maximize their influence, and increasingly I think they're doing so.
I'll just tell a quick South Carolina story because it's a good one to remember about the effect of rules. So the South Carolina primary in January 2008 was a critical one for Barack Obama. It was right before the big Super Duper Tuesday where 22 states were voting that first Tuesday in February, and he'd stumbled in New Hampshire. I think we sort of have a draw in state of Nevada, but he won big in South Carolina, and it was really important for his being able to sort of keep things going forward. He has not been back to South Carolina since then. That was January 2008. Just a few miles away is North Carolina, right? In the November of 2008, Barack Obama got 45% of the vote in South Carolina. Not bad, but not close enough to really be seen as a swing state. He got 49% of the vote in North Carolina. Not that much better, but he won it. It was a really close state, and he won it. He was in North Carolina 18 times during his first term, and they held a convention there. But even though it was only in Charlotte, it's only a few miles away from South Carolina, he didn't go into South Carolina. And it's not because he didn't care about what they did for him in the primary. It's just, you're running for president, you're trying to stay in office, and it's that narrow a difference, 49% versus 45%, that makes all the difference when you have winner-take-all politics and our current electoral college system.
More questions? Well, thank you to our panel, Pat, Andrea, Victoria, Rick, Rob.
And thank you, Krist, for coming all the way across the country just last Friday. Krist was
Can't keep me away.
On the stage with Sir Paul McCartney.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So, and here he is today. So,
on
another grand stage. So, thank you.
All the world's a stage, and thank you, NYU, right?
I want to say one thing. I'll let Krist close it, but just before we leave, FairVote people, can you raise your hand just so people during the reception? We've got a lot of FairVote interns, FairVote staff, and doing great work. So thank you for all that you're doing, and find them during the reception. We do have a reception in the back. Thanks again to NYU, and back to Krist.
Oh, and thank you all in the audience for coming tonight. And tell your